Mr. Stewart.
Thank you. Dr. Applewhite, you're familiar, of course, with the possible or potential outcomes from a judicial committee that might have come to a finding of child sexual abuse having occurred, being essentially a repentance, acceptance of repentance, and therefore removal from position, maybe removal of privileges but staying in the congregation, or disfellowship. Those are the essential outcomes, aren't they?
Essentially.
Yes. So if someone is in the congregation is found to have committed sexual abuse and the judicial committee finds them sufficiently repentant, then they remain in the congregation. Is that right?
Yes.
And if they are not sufficiently repentant, then they will be disfellowshipped, which means they're out of the congregation.
Yes.
And the repentance, of course, would come with an acceptance that they had done what they were accused of having done.
Yes.
Yes. And if the repentant wrongdoer was a wrongdoer in relation to one of his or her own children, they would go back into the family.
As far as I understand, yes.
Unless there was a report to the authorities.
Well, normally yes.
And intervention by the authorities. But insofar as the organisation's own steps are concerned, that would be the ordinary course.
Yes.
And if there was a repentance and then reproval, the reasons for the reproval are not published to the congregation. Is that right?
Yes.
And so the congregation will be left not knowing why this person has been reproved.
If no further activity is occurring, that's right.
Well, by further activity, what do you mean?
In some cases, if they're reproved for child abuse, then they would be asked to not spend time with children and not be with them in the Kingdom Hall and things of that nature. If they were displaying behavior that was of that nature, then the procedure would be to warn the families that have children in the congregation.
Well, perhaps particular families in which that person has a relationship or engagement. Is that right?
My understanding was that it would be anyone in the congregation that has minor children.
All right,
that I would have to look at that further.
All right. Well, that may be subject to us looking at it further, but. You accept, and I think you've written or spoken on this subject, you accept that a child abuser, child sexual abuser is unlikely to be able to stop abusing. In other words, once a child abuser, there's likely to be reoffending, not so.
It's a very complicated question, but once somebody abuses, once their internal mechanisms of control have allowed them to cause mechanisms of control for the future.
And so really positive steps need to be taken to ensure that such a person doesn't have access or opportunity.
Yes.
Would that be right? And that ability to take effective child-safe action, given what we've just been through, it doesn't exist in the Jehovah's Witnesses' current procedures, does it?
Well, Yeah, I don't think it's just the current procedures. I don't think that they have the authority to remove a child from a home.
Well, that certainly. But if the law would require them to report, then they say they would report, not so.
Yes.
But in the absence of such a requirement, then they're not likely to report, or certainly not required by their documents to report to child protection authorities.
Their documents say if there's a law that we are mandated to report, we report. And I find that's true for most religious organizations, that in the absence of a mandated reporter requirement, that they often don't report abuse.
Well, that's of course the subject of some other inquiries or case studies within this Royal Commission. Of course, what's required, you agreed earlier, or said earlier, as I understand it, for current best practice is for an organisation to have a strong and effective relationship with child protection authorities.
Yes.
And that's absent in this case, isn't it? In the case of the Jehovah's Witnesses.
I haven't examined particular cases to know whether they're cooperative with authorities or not. And my read of their statements and the statement of the witness from the legal department is that they're instructed to be cooperative with the authorities. Where
the authorities come forward and require them to do so. Not so. I mean, I withdraw that. Let's go back and deal with it at a documentary level. There's nothing that requires or even encourages elders to encourage others to report to the authorities. That's right, isn't it?
What's required is that they are clear that it's the personal decision of the individual whether they're going to report or not.
Yes.
So the word encouraged is not used. I like the word encouraged. That particular word isn't used. What they say is that they should never be discouraged and that they should be clear that it's their right to do so and that nobody's going to criticize them if they go to the authorities.
And you will have picked up through your reading of the policies and documents and teachings and so on, something of an antipathy to the secular authorities. It's a difficult relationship that the Jehovah's Witnesses have with the secular authorities.
I haven't picked that up.
And if that was found to be so, then you would accept, of course, that that element of a strong and constructive relationship is absent.
If it was found that they don't have a strong and constructive relationship, would I accept that they don't have?
No, if it's found that they have a relationship of antipathy with secular authorities, then that component of the best practice would not be met.
I would really have to see what it was that was found before I could say. My read of the documents and the way that the director of the legal department has described the procedures and what the elders are instructed to do sounds to me like he's saying follow the law and cooperate with the authorities. And even in a case where somebody else reported to the authorities to cooperate with them, give them documents as required.
So your opinion on that point is based on what he said in his statement?
What he said in his statement and also the other documents that say we've never discouraged anyone from reporting to the police.
There's no document that says that.
We've never. There's a letter to the elders that says for many years we've encouraged we've told the elders to follow the law.
Yes. Well, that's a different point, isn't it? So to the extent to which that opinion is based on Mr. Toole's statement as to what takes place, then if those aspects of the statement are not accepted by the Royal Commission, then your opinion would have to be revisited in that respect, wouldn't it?
Sure.
Because I'd like to suggest to you that the Jehovah's Witnesses policies and procedures with regard to raising and responding to child sexual abuse allegations are significantly deficient of current best practice.
Currently?
Yes. Do you accept that?
That's your opinion?
No, but that is the position. It is. My opinion is irrelevant. I'm suggesting to you that it would be right for this commission to come to the conclusion, based on the evidence and on what you've had to say, that the Jehovah's Witnesses' current policies and procedures with regard to raising and responding to child sexual abuse allegations are deficient when measured against current best practice.
Okay. So when it comes to what they're doing now, I find that much of what they're doing now is consistent with what I see in other religious organizations. If the question is, does it meet all current best practices? I would say it probably doesn't. There could easily be ways that many religious organizations could raise the bar and meet better practices.
Is it right, though, to compare them with other religious organisations, or just what best practice should be, religious, school, or anything else?
I find that the practices in different, for example, the practices in social service organizations tend to move along faster because you have more knowledgeable people who are working in the field. And then you have schools that move along faster, and I find that religious organizations, by and large, move more slowly in developing practices that relate to social services, these particular kinds of social services. So to compare them to, for example, a foster care organization, I wouldn't normally do that. I don't know what this commission will do.
I don't know about whether comparison's the right way to go anyway. Isn't the object of all of this for us to try and work out and tell all institutions, whatever, this is the practice you should follow, not what the best religious practice is, this is the practice you should follow.
I absolutely hope that that's the outcome. I mean, that's what I'm hoping for. And so that if we came here 5 years from now and someone said, what would you point to for the standard of care? I would say, look at the recommendations that came out of the Royal Commission. I mean, that to me is the hope. And that there would be certain practices that would be across the board, no matter who the person is or no matter what the organization is, but then certain things that would relate specifically to different types of organizations.
Well, as we were talking about the issue before lunch, as to the requirements of the judicial hearing procedure, you and I had a discussion about that, you remember. There's a fundamental problem there, isn't there, with the way it's constituted under the current provided procedure.
The way that what is constituted?
The 2 men, then 3 men, then the survivor, having to tell their story without moral support with the accused present. That process we talked about before lunch, and we agreed, I think, that that's not an appropriate process to follow. Correct?
There are better ways.
Absolutely. Now, can you help us from your knowledge of the Jehovah's Witnesses? As I understand it, those procedures are generated in part because of the structure of the organisation. Correct?
Yes.
How do they go about solving that problem and responding better to those who allege they've been sexually abused?
And my understanding is that this practice is happening now, but there will, I'm sure, be other people who can speak to it. But from my perspective, they solve it by allowing a person who wants to come forward to have a support person with them to speak to an elder. And if they would prefer to, I mean, there are some people who want to confront the person who abused them.
Oh, there are some who do, but there's many who don't.
Absolutely.
And many don't want to be in the same room as the person who assaulted them.
Or the same building.
That's right.
So, you know, from my perspective, I think the maximum number of choices that you can give to allow the person to speak in the way that's most comfortable for them. Everything from where do you meet to who's there to how is the information taken down. So I would say the maximum number of choices within their structure, that would probably look like giving them the option to write the letter, allowing someone else to speak who has listened to their testimony, having or not meeting with anybody at all and submitting it in the letter.
So I understand what you're talking about runs into conflict with the Bible, as the Jehovah's Witnesses understand it.
It may with the piece of having more than one witness.
Well, more than that, confronting your alleged wrongdoer is another component of it, isn't it?
I think that I think that they allow the letter to act as the confrontation, that someone's reading it, it's the words of the person, and that person's being confronted.
Well, these are things that you think, but you can't give us a document that identifies it, can you?
I believe that in the, I'll have to see the statements, but I believe that in the statements that were provided by the director of the legal office and the director of the service desk.
Now, how do we overcome the problem that your allegation won't be accepted if there isn't another witness?
That's from the internal process. You know, that's a piece that's still going to be problematic for someone who doesn't have another witness.
Which is going to be the case for many sexual assault cases, isn't it?
It is.
How do we deal with that?
That's a tough one.
Because for those who've been abused and traumatised, a complaint which they're required to make, which is then not found in their favour, has a potential to further traumatise, doesn't it?
It is. It is.
I mean, it's by no means an ideal place for someone's psychological well-being to be placed, is it?
It's true.
I'd like to move on, Dr. Applewhite, to the second issue that you addressed, or issue 4, as it's termed on page 7 of your report, which concerns information regarding the systems, policies and procedures in place within the church and the society, that's the Watchtower Society, to prevent child sexual abuse within the church. And as I understand the report, your conclusions on that issue are set out in, and therefore your opinions are set out in paragraphs 45 and 46, is that right?
Yes.
And the facts and assumptions on which you base that are set out in the preceding paragraphs 37 to 44.
Yes.
And just identifying the opinion in 45, you say, in my opinion, Jehovah's Witnesses were well in advance of other religious organizations in providing educational materials to parents and families. So I understand by your use of the past tense there, you're referring to the period of the 1980s and 1990s. Is that right?
That's correct.
And because you go on to say the quality of the materials they provided during that period, in other words, the 1980s and 90s, exceeded the standards of care for the time and continue to be more substantial than what many religious organizations offer parents and guardians today. So insofar as the quality of the materials provided by the Jehovah's Witnesses are concerned, you've set out in the preceding paragraphs what you rely on, and that's well understood. But of course, insofar as the standards of care for the time are concerned, in other organizations, that we can't see what you've based that on.
Right, and we're back to the same problem that we had before, which was that I haven't laid out. For example, when was the first time that another or 10 other religious organizations first provided information to parents and families? I haven't set that out here.
And what the quality of their material was.
That's right.
Yes.
Well, there was very little of it, but that's right.
And then also there's the component of it, of that sentence, that the quality of the materials provided by the Jehovah's Witnesses continue to be more substantial than what many religious organizations offer parents and guardians today. That suffers from the same difficulty for us. You see that?
I do.
And of course, by saying many religious organizations, that leaves us not knowing whether that's proportionately how many. I mean, many could still be a very small proportion.
Sure.
One doesn't really know where you see the Jehovah's Witnesses standing relative to current practices of provision of materials.
Yes, and providing directly to parents and guardians information about sexual abuse, what to watch for, how to respond if their child discloses. That's been something that's developed in the post-2000 time frame, but I haven't provided you with information about, for example, the first year that those were provided in various religious organizations.
And then in paragraph 46, you say since 2002, extensive programs of sexual abuse prevention have been initiated by other religious organizations, and the standards of care in this respect have developed significantly over the past decade. However, you say most of the efforts of these religious organizations have naturally focused on prevention within their own programming for children and youth. And then you say, which is what I'm really getting to, is in my own experience, I've not found examples in Australia of religious organizations that have provided parents, guardians, and general public with the quality or consistency of information about prevention in response to sexual abuse, or about how to support those who have been abused that Jehovah's Witnesses have provided in their publications. But of course, your experience in Australia is limited to those various Catholic organizations you identified earlier and some other participants of those educative programs. Is that right?
When you say some other participants, they would be from religious organizations and social service organizations.
Participants in educative programs run by you?
Yes, but I've had contact beyond having an educational program where I've asked to review materials. I try to keep up with what are current policies in various religious organizations and other organizations that serve children. So I've asked for those materials and received them and reviewed them.
You wouldn't be making the claim that you've kept up with materials that are provided by organizations directly to their members or into families, to parents and families.
So what I would ask for is any educational programs that they're using and what those materials would be. And that would include things for their staff, for their volunteers, things for their clergy, things for foster parents, and also parents and children.
All right, specifically, can you identify which organizations?
That I've asked for those materials?
Asked, received, and reviewed.
I can't. I would have to go back to emails and correspondence and things of that nature to identify those organizations.
And then you've, well, I'll come to the other opinions in a moment, perhaps. Just on this question of the clarity of the message, and undoubtedly some of these articles do have very clear messages, or to some degree, but there are one or two aspects I'd like to bring to your attention. So I want to show you an article which was published in Awake on 22 June 1982, and it's titled "To End Child Abuse." And I'll have copies for you and others in a moment. While that's being located, we can look at one of the others, which is in the bundle at tab 82. You referred to this, in fact, in your paragraph 42B. And if we can look at tab 82 on the screen. And this is a collection of a number of articles which you identify and refer to, and there's a lot of information provided there. There's just one aspect in particular that I want to ask you about. If we go to page 13, that's the second from the end on ringtail. Yeah, that page. Just go down a little bit. Okay. Now, You'll see there's this bit at the end, under the heading, the end of abuse. And in particular from the foot of the left-hand column, it says, Jehovah God promises a time when all such treacherous people will be torn away from the earth, and only the meek and gentle who love God and fellow man will be allowed to remain. We have that marvelous hope of a new world thanks to the random sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Then and only then will abuse end forever. In the meantime, we must do all we can to protect our children. And then it goes on. And I'm wondering what meaning you would expect a parent reading that to get from that. How's that to be understood by an ordinary parishioner or publisher reading that?
I don't think I'm qualified to answer that question as to what that particular phrase or the particular lines that you read would necessarily mean to somebody who was a publisher.
All right, and perhaps if you can look at the other article that I've got for you. It's really quite similar, the 1982 one. And if we can look on the second page, you'll see halfway down the second column is, I think, much the same.
I only got one page. Oh, here it is. It's on the back.
So you see halfway down the second column, only the Bible's solution will end the abuse of children. Jesus summed it up, love God with your whole heart, love your neighbor as yourself. The Apostle Paul repeated it, love does not work evil to one's neighbor, therefore love is the law's fulfillment. This solution of brotherly love is practical. When applied, it works. Too many are hearers of God's word, but not doers of it. Too many say, Lord, Lord, but don't listen to Jesus or do Jehovah's will. In God's due time, all who embrace his kingdom under Christ will become able to keep this law of love perfectly. Then will come fulfillment of Proverbs 2:21 and 22. The upright are the ones that will reside in the earth, and the blameless are the ones that will be left over in it. As regards the wicked, they'll be cut off from the very earth, and as for the treacherous, they'll be torn away from it. This is the only way, the final way, to end child abuse. A parent who may be interested or concerned about child abuse, how do you suppose they would understand that to apply in their lives?
I think you would have to ask a publisher. I think you'd have to ask a member of the congregation exactly how they would respond to that.
My only suggestion is that while some of the messages are very clear, and I accept that entirely, there are other messages, so it seems to me, and I suggest to you, that are quite unclear.
Again, I mean, what's unclear to me as a person who hasn't studied this in this way, I'm not sure that I'm the one to answer it.
Now, have you given any consideration to the effect that these articles have in the context of being in amongst a lot of other information and articles being published and given to publishers?
Could you be more specific?
Have you given any consideration to the effect that these articles have in the context of being amongst a lot of other information and articles that are being made available or published to members of the congregation? In other words, you've looked at the articles and what they say. Have you looked beyond that? What are they being read? How are they being understood in the context of a lot of other information?
Well, there's a general practice of everyone reading, so it's not just printed and put on a shelf. People read them together and discuss them together. And what's happened is that many times throughout the years, particular articles that speak to the issues of sexual abuse and talk about the experience of someone who's been abused have been referred back to in letters to congregations or referred back to in certain teaching moments. So those would be brought back up.
And these are principally published in the Awake and Watchtower magazines, is that right?
Principally, yes.
And are you aware how many editions of each of those there are each year?
I've seen it written, but 4 times a year. Or I'm not sure. I think they're published at different times, but I'm not sure. But there are multiple issues a year.
And multiple articles per issue.
Yes.
So it may be that these child sexual abuse articles get relatively swamped by other information that's been provided.
I can't answer that. I just don't know.
You see in your conclusion at paragraph 49, right at the end, you say Jehovah's Witnesses excel in providing such educational materials to parents and family members, and the substance of their materials concerning child abuse is exceptionally clear and helpful. I suppose what I'm taking exception with is your use of the word exceptionally, and I would suggest that it might be qualified in the way in which I've put to you.
Well, so what I would be referring to there is, for example, an article that says, if your child experiences abuse, be sure that you don't just say to them one time, it's not your fault. That you may have to come back and have another conversation with the child and let them know that you really believe that more than once. And when I say exceptional as far as distribution, it would be very... The infrastructure for getting this kind of material to be read and reviewed by individuals in a congregation of any religious organization, it's just unusual to have the infrastructure available for the printed material to be there and everyone to review it and to have a discussion. And in my experience with parents and voluntary, for example, a school saying we're going to have an educational evening and parents can come and learn about sexual abuse. A lot of preparation can go into that, and an awful lot of people don't show up. So you can have a big forum and let people know that you're there and have 5 people show up. So it's a terribly difficult topic for people. And so to actually get the educational materials out there into families, they just have a unique infrastructure available to them for that.
You're not saying that it's your experience that each article is discussed in a structured way. It's the case, isn't it, that some articles are chosen for particular study, but others are there just for people to read when and if they want to.
There's a structure to reviewing every Watchtower that comes out. So, that's a piece that there's Watchtower study, so they would go over those. Awake magazine is not as formal, but people read those articles and often sit down with people and we'll go over those articles in Bible study time and things of that nature. So it's a more structured process than just mailing it to people's house and hoping that they read it.
How do you know about the sitting down and discussing it? Where do you have that knowledge from?
There are letters that are sent that say review, for example, to all congregations. This is a 15-minute talk, and you need to review this article, and you need to ask these questions. So there's within their materials where they talk about the structure of meetings and what's going to happen in individual meetings, you'll find that kind of structure.
But that's my point. That's in respect of certain select articles, but not everything, isn't it?
Not everything that they publish would have someone up there teaching and going over there. That's true.
Or a structured response to reading it, dealing with it, studying it.
Not everyone, but in particular the articles that were published in 1985 in the whole magazine that was devoted to child sexual abuse in 1985. That one has had times when there would be a letter that goes out that says review these articles.
Now, dealing with the question of prevention of abuse and the circumstances in which it occurs, you take it, or I take it that you're familiar, at least to some degree, with the work of David Finkerlaw.
Yes.
He's a leading researcher and academic and writer in the field, isn't he?
Yes, he is.
And I think you mention him in your report at paragraph 43A, saying that it's a good thing that his name was picked up in one of the articles by published by the Jehovah's Witnesses, not so.
I just wanted to illustrate the fact that there are solid researchers that are cited in the articles.
Solid and credible.
Incredible.
Are you familiar with the Australian Institute for Family Studies report published last month, June 2015?
Was it on education for children?
Conceptualizing the prevention of child sexual abuse.
Conceptualizing. I've seen it, but I don't recall the contents of it right now.
I'm going to give you a copy.
Thank you.
But particularly I'm interested in chapter A5 of that report, which starts at page 30. And you'll see it deals with theories on how and why child sexual abuse occurs. You can scroll down. And it says there are various psychological and criminological theories and so on. And then in the second paragraph, this section describes 3 key etiological theories used to explain why child sexual abuse occurs. And the first one identified as Finkelau's 4 preconditions model. Do you see that?
Yes.
Are you familiar with that model?
Yes, that's been around for a long time.
Yeah. So Finkelau published that in 1984, but it's still regarded as a key theory about the causation, or as it's put here, etiological theory to explain why child sexual abuse occurs.
Yes.
It's not discredited.
Not to my knowledge.
And you'll see, if we scroll down a bit further, it says that Finkelau's model has been widely used for understanding child sexual abuse offenders. It was the first to move beyond the notion that child sexual abuse only occurs as father-daughter incest or when men who are strangers molest a multitude of children. And the 4 preconditions are, and he identifies them, or they are identified there in bullet points. Firstly, motivation to sexually abuse. Secondly, overcoming internal inhibitors. Thirdly, overcoming external inhibitors. And finally, overcoming the resistance of the child. And according to this theory, all of those preconditions need to be met in order for child sexual abuse perpetration to be possible and to occur. But the model takes it a step further, and if we look over the page, in the third paragraph, it says that Finkelau noted that these preconditions, in other words, those 4 necessary preconditions, all of which have to exist, not only operate on an individual level, but on a more sociological level. Social factors and characteristics can act as motivators or inhibitors to child sexual abuse perpetration. And then Table 4 outlines how the preconditions work in relation to individual and social cultural factors. Mm-hmm. And then you'll see down the left-hand side are the 4 preconditions in the first column that I read out earlier. And then adjacent to each of them in the subsequent columns is firstly the individual factors, and there's a list of them, and then the social cultural factors in the right-hand column. Do you see that?
Yes.
And so looking at the social cultural factors, I want to identify some which I suggest exist within the Jehovah's Witness organization and get your response to that. So firstly, in other words, in the first row that's adjacent to the precondition of motivation to sexually abuse, one of the factors, social cultural factors, is repressive norms about masturbation and extramarital sex. Now, you'd agree that is a factor existing within the Jehovah's Witness community.
Well, so, yes.
Yes. And then in the second line, in other words, adjacent to overcoming internal inhibitors as the precondition, you'll see that the second social cultural factor is weak criminal sanctions against offenders. Now, in an environment where, and I'll ask you to assume that reporting to authorities is only done where the law requires, and within the Jehovah's Witnesses there are weak criminal sanctions against offenders. Well,
I've told you my position as far as having, the that I really believe that the criminal sanctions are necessary. Anytime someone can behave in a certain way and not have consequences for their behavior, then they're not less likely to desist the behavior. So we always want there to be clear consequences for the behavior that can act as a deterrent.
And do you accept that the processes of investigation and so on that we've been through before, and the way in which child sexual abuse allegations are dealt with within the Jehovah's Witness community by the elders and so on, would generally delay any report being made to the authorities?
I would have to look at a case to determine that, if it happened in a certain case. But from my perspective, if they're mandated to report and they report, then their own investigation should be set aside while the criminal justice system does their work.
Well, you should know in Australia, and perhaps you do know this, that the current position is it's only in New South Wales and Victoria that there are crimes for not reporting.
Yes.
And there's no mandatory reporting to child protection authorities applicable in this context, because there aren't teachers or other designated professions.
Right.
So essentially, for the most part, absence of criminal sanction if you don't report, all mandatory reporting requirements. If people see within their community a system that is supposed to and tries to deal with these issues, that's going to delay any attempt to report outside and ensure that the authorities can deal with it.
Which is why I would advocate for those laws to be changed.
And the third social cultural factor, the one immediately beneath weak criminal sanctions, is ideology of patriarchal prerogatives for fathers. That's, of course, true within the Jehovah's Witnesses, isn't it?
I would have to read a little bit more about what they mean by patriarchal prerogatives for fathers, but it's possible.
Well, it's
possible that that's consistent, but I would just have to read a little bit more in the background of what they're referring to.
All right.
Because, for example, the one that you mentioned before, I've read some of that research, and really they're talking about in the absence of another sexual partner that a person would be more likely to abuse a child. And so there's more to each one of these than can just be read in one line.
I accept that. Of course, it is a patriarchal organization.
It is.
And in the third row, adjacent to the precondition of overcoming external inhibitors, insofar as social and cultural factors are concerned, there's certainly barriers to women's equality. You would agree?
Yes.
And there's strong ideology of family sanctity. You would agree?
Yes, I just don't know I don't know how that relates. So is this, generally speaking, I just haven't come back, but when they are applying the model to these cultural factors, are they generally speaking about incest type offending?
No. No, it's not specifically not limited to that, because Finkelor...
No, I know Finkelhor wasn't referring to it. I'm talking about this application of it.
No, this isn't the application. This is a tabular form of the model.
Yeah, I would have to look at that a little bit more, because for organizational type abuse or abuse that happens in organizations, that particular piece of it, it wouldn't be as related to institutional type abuse. But that would be related to incest type abuse.
Yes, yes. But if you've got a situation where what goes on in the family is very much the subject of the church, including the church's disciplinary processes, then and the church has a strong ideology of family sanctity, then this would be regarded as, or you would see this as being met, wouldn't you?
According to this, yes.
And What about the one immediately above that, erosion of social networks, insofar as instructions about not associating with worldly people are concerned?
You might see it that way.
And then in the last row, overcoming the resistance of the child, a social cultural factor of social powerlessness of children. Do you accept that within the Jehovah's Witness Church?
It's not a factor that I've looked at carefully. I would say that they've been encouraged to talk with their children about sexual matters, and that those lines of communication would probably be a helpful factor. The social powerlessness, I'm just not sure about.
Because this model would certainly raise for you some flashing lights about the social cultural environment of the Jehovah's Witness Church insofar as child sexual abuse is concerned, wouldn't it?
Tell me what you mean by flashing lights.
These factors come together really in a perfect storm for the Jehovah's Witnesses in the risk of child sexual abuse occurring there.
I think I would have to look at this more carefully to be able to say that. I just would have to look more carefully.
Those are my questions, John.
I think we should mark the document to end child abuse. I'll make it 2914. And the document conceptualising the prevention of child sexual abuse will be 2915. Doctor, just to finish the discussion that you and I had previously, if a woman brings an allegation that she's been sexually assaulted by a member of the Jehovah's Witness, and she does so because of her strong adherence to the tenets of the church and believes that she has to report, but she doesn't want to go to the authorities. She doesn't want to be involved in a criminal trial. And there's no other witness, and the alleged abuser doesn't confess. But those listening to her story don't have any doubt that she's telling the truth. But they can't take any action because there's only her evidence. What happens then within the church? I assume, well, you tell me, does the abuser then stay with all of his rights intact, and the woman would be required to, if she wished to remain part of the Jehovah's Witnesses, to interact with him in that environment? Is that what happens?
In addition to some other warnings or things of that nature, I would think that that would be what would happen.
It's not a very good place to end up, is it?
It isn't.
No. Yes, does anyone else have any questions?
Yes, please, Your Honour.
Anyone else?
No, Your Honour.
No.
No? No. Very well, yes.
Thank you, Your Honour. Your Honour, pardon me. Your Honour, Dr. Applewhite, as you know, my name is Andrew Tokley. I represent the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of Australia, and I also represent 3 persons who have been called to give evidence before the Commission. Dr. Applewhite, I wish to ask you some questions about your report. If I may, if you could bring that up, please. Have that before you.
Pardon me, I don't want to interrupt you, but would it be possible to take a short break before we finish up?
You want to take a break now?
Would that be possible? Or,
Yeah, sure.
Or I just, is it all right?
Yeah, we'll take a short break. Let me know when you're ready.
Thank you.
Both sides.